Hi, I'm Heidi Moreby. I head up the agency team at Culture Recruitment. So we're a recruitment business that specialises in marketing, HR, sales, accountancy and finance, and the agency market. And today we are going to be spending some time talking about how businesses can build and maintain a really positive culture during a pandemic, with many of us working entirely remotely. So this is a subject that we've heard so many people talk about as a really key business challenge right now, and it's becoming so important. We're now in lockdown two. The novelty of being at home has totally worn off. Um, the Zoom quizzes that we relied on have had their day, and we know there's so much more to building culture, engaging our employees, and valuing our teams, which is what Courtney's here to talk about today.
I am a brand consultant and founder of a company called Create and Propel, and my mission is to help make strategic branding accessible for brands of all sizes and, of course, industries. And I guess in a nutshell, what I help businesses do is articulate what they offer and what they stand for in a way that's meaningful to both their customers and their staff and helps propel their business forward. And so all of this comes into play because culture is such a huge part of building your brand and making sure that you're successful in the marketplace. And of course, I'll talk to all of those different bits and bobs. But I think what's important is maybe if we start with defining what culture is, because it is a little bit of a buzzword and a little bit of jargon that we experience. And so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So, culture in a nutshell are the ideas, customs and behaviors that you collectively share. So my example that I always give is I am a Southern belle. I'm from the deep South in America. And so there's lots of things that I do and say that other Southerners who I've never met nor will ever meet in my life also share with me. And so when we bring that into a workplace, it's your way of doing things. It's the things and values and sets of activities and behaviors we expect from our employees and our colleagues. And so that's what brings us all together and make sure that we're steering the ship in the same direction. And of course, kind of going to that piece of why it's so important, your team experience and the way that your customers or your staff feel about your business is going to replicate itself into the customer experience. So if you've ever gone perhaps to a fast food restaurant and you've been like, wow, that staff member was really rude or gave me a bad experience, well, it's probably because there's something off in the culture or the team wasn't engaged. And so this is so important when we look at this from a perspective of building this in a virtual world when we're also physically separated, is how do you keep people engaged and on board? How do you build a culture that's thriving and that delivers more for you and for your customers? And I would say quickly just on what's the impact of a great culture, because there might be a lot of leaders that are watching this and go, why should I pay attention? Why should I care? You absolutely should. And there are so many studies from Forbes, Harvard Business Review, you name it. There's something out there that's going to give you a stat. And what I've done is just collate that into the top things. So in short, a strong culture fosters great staff engagement, but what does that actually deliver to your business? Well, number one, highly engaged teams are more productive. So when your team is engaged, they're going to be delivering more for you as a leader in the business. Number two, highly engaged teams experience less absenteeism and less turnover. So number one, you're going to have less sick days because people are going to be probably mentally thriving, but they're also going to want to make sure they deliver above and beyond for you. But they're also going to stay with you longer, which means less time and resources wasted on constantly recruiting people into the same roles. And I guess last is they have higher customer satisfaction. So that goes back to that great customer experience comes from happy employees. So in short, by engaging and investing in your culture, your business is going to be more profitable, which is what all of us want.
So, how do we build a culture? Where do we start? What do we do?
Yeah, I think before we get into how you build it virtually, you need to understand how you build a culture at all, which is so important. And so the first step for building a culture is making sure that you have a platform and you clarify what is it that we stand for as an organization. So if you want everybody to collectively share a set of beliefs, you need to be very prescriptive with what those beliefs are. So there are three elements to it. This is the foundation of your brand and the foundation for any successful team to make sure we're steering the ship in the right direction. There's three elements. The first is your vision. So where is it that we want to go? And that vision might be in 5 years' time, but during an environment like COVID-19, it might be 1 month's time. Okay. So where are we all driving together towards? Number two is having a clear mission. And so a clear sense of purpose. A great example of this is that example where people say somebody went up to a janitor in NASA and said, "What do you do?" And they said, "I put a man on the moon." So that's a great mission because it's about having something that's bigger than what I'm doing in my 9 to 5 and making sure that we all live and breathe that. But last but certainly not least is a clear set of values. So a great way that this comes into application is when you leave your team to handle a sticky situation on their own, there is no way as a leader that you're going to be able to give somebody a defined set of rules of how to deal with that because chances are every single interaction is going to be different. But when you have a set of values or a belief system, that gives your team a guide for how to interact and what's my rules of engagement that I sort of live within. And so that's the bare bottom foundation of building a culture is because you have to be very prescriptive about that. And I will say that is not just having some papers stuck up on a wall or that, cheesy motivational poster that you see in a lot of films and stuff that says, "Oh, we value teamwork" and things like that. It needs to be something that is a guide for living and breathing. And if you imagine when you onboard that new team member in and they go, "What's it like here?" Or "What do we do outside of get on my emails every day at 9 a.m.?" It's, well, these are the things that we value. And this is what we actually do as a team when we're working together to achieve that. I will say number two, once you have that foundation, is creating an open dialogue with your team across levels. So what's important is that we never have an organization or a culture that is overly hierarchical. And I'm not saying that you need to completely strip that away because that's not appropriate for every single organization. But we can't just have our senior management team or our CEO sitting up top and then everybody else fends for themselves. You want everybody learning from each other. It's about continuous improvement. And so great cultures are talking to each other. They are constantly having these conversations. And third, you demonstrate the value you place in your team. So that's part of your investment back into them. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've got a great leader who I know is telling me how much they value their team. They're going home and telling their partner, they're telling their friends. Outside of work, they cannot stop talking about it. But then they get to their desk, they open their email, they see that we're behind on sales, or they get stuck in meetings all day, or they never have time to talk to people. And so what happens is there's a disconnect because you have your team that's going, "Well, I don't feel value. I don't feel seen or heard by my organization." And so what's happening is it's creating this further divide. And to have a great culture, you need to make sure that you are all having that open dialogue. How do we do that? By doing things that demonstrate that value. And I will say before we move forward, and I'll say this again, I'm sure in some of these questions, just having a pizza party or having a Zoom happy hour isn't demonstrating value to your employees if they're not enjoying those things. It's about listening to them in that two-way dialogue and then reacting and giving them a value that they actually value.
So it's not just about telling them, it's about the delivery of really bringing those values to life day to day for them.
Absolutely. If you have a set of values that only sits on a poster or is like 15 values long that no one's going to remember, then you have just wasted your investment. You want to make sure that your values feel relevant and they feel colloquial to your organization. They're things that people actually remember and they reflect the way that you guys actually engage. So the number one value that I think every organization has is integrity. Usually the first thing that I'll do is go in there and say, "Okay, so tell me what that sounds like for you," because I hear that word and it means a million things to different people.
Buzzword.
Yes, absolutely. I'm telling you, most organizations have that one. And it's not that you can't, but it's just, is that realistic and honest and authentic to who you guys are? Because if I sit down with a new starter and say, "So what does integrity look at X organization?" and they don't know, well, then it's probably not truthful to who you guys are. So you want things that you're actually going to use and enjoy.
So when we're thinking about building a culture when we're not physically present in the office, as we are now and have been for a lot of people for quite some time, how do we do that?
Okay, so it's very similar to building a culture in person, but I would say the main thing that we need to keep in mind is the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, people are incredibly physically separate at the moment. And the great thing about 2020 is there's so much technology that means that we're constantly talking to each other. But I suppose it's thinking about how meaningful those conversations are. So the first part is to foster a strong, two-way dialogue. And when I
Mm.
say strong, I'm talking about a meaningful conversation. That means we're kind of bottling some of the conversations that perhaps happened in the break room or when we were making a cup of tea and taking that and bringing it virtually. So the first thing is to over communicate what's going on in the business to keep your employees in the loop. And I know a lot of leaders will think, well, I am talking to them, I'm sending emails, or I'm having one-to-one conversations with a few people in the organization. That's probably not enough. And I would say, I'm sure that you can vouch for this. When employees don't know what's going on or they're not being talked to, they make assumptions, and assumptions lead to fear. And fear is the
Yeah.
worst possible thing. It's the most destructive thing in an organization. So even if you feel like you are way over communicating what's getting across, it's probably very beneficial for your team to know this is what's happening in the business today, guys. This is to keep you in the loop. And so everybody's on the same page. And that's kind of looking back to in an organization when you're meeting in person in the office, you can do that. Hey, quick, can I just grab everybody's attention really
Mhm.
quickly? It's the equivalent of that online. And there's lots of ways that you can do that via email or video or however it works, whatever kind of communication platforms you guys are using in your business.
We're definitely hearing so much of that. I think from a candidate perspective, particularly with the furlough time and some people working, some people not, people being kind of slowly phased back in. I guess if I could say the main frustration, concern, worry for candidates, it is that they don't know what's going on or they feel like they don't know what's going on. And it seems so easy to rectify that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think the reason why this is probably such an important part, even though it feels like a pretty obvious recommendation, is let's put ourselves into the shoes of the leaders that are watching this video. You guys have been fighting fires since the beginning of this year, and there has been no time to breathe. And so you are putting all of your effort just to keep this business afloat. And so, unfortunately, as a result of that, you're not stepping out from an umbrella perspective to go, does everybody know what's in my head? And it's like when we're so busy, we're not putting our effort into thinking about that. And so, definitely, when we look at these furloughed people entering the business again, or perhaps even just people that have been there for the entire journey, your candidates, whoever it might be, they don't know what's happening and they're making assumptions and they're listening to what's happening around the world and in the news, which is unfortunately very negative. And so it's important that every once in a while you pull your head out from under the water and you go, okay, let's take a breather, let's look, let's reflect, let me make sure that I'm telling you everything that I'm seeing. And I will say, you don't have to be completely honest. There's probably some things going on in the business that you can't talk about with everybody, but making sure that you're giving enough information to where people aren't spreading gossip or asking too many
Mm.
questions. Because I understand why you might not be communicating, but I'm telling you, the negative effects of not doing that are far outweighing the amount of time it would take you just to give people a little bit of an update.
Mhm.
So I'd say on that note, the number two thing is to make sure that you are giving people hope, and you're leading the mentality that you want to see, because as I mentioned, there's so much negativity happening right now in the market, in the news, and social media. And so it's very difficult in a global recession or a global pandemic like COVID-19 to keep people feeling positive about the journey ahead. And it's not Mickey Mousing it. I often use that example because I think sometimes feel like you need to give this Disney like approach to go, everything's fine. Everything's
Mm.
just going to be fine. Your employees can see through that. That's not authentic, and it's not looking at where we are in the reality, but it's finding the positive and making sure that you're driving that home. And even on those days when you are beat and you just feel like you cannot see the light, you need to make sure that if you don't want your employees to pick up on that behavior, that you are leading the kind of example and environment that you want to create for them, because culture is a top down experience. So
Mm.
whatever the leadership values, whatever the leadership feels, your employees feel that too. And I know that puts a lot of weight on a lot of leaders' shoulders, but it's important that you reflect the kind of thing that you want to see back reflected back to you from your team. And I'd say in that light, looking at all of this, it's making sure that you don't just talk to your team when you're communicating to them, but you're listening to them as well. And so you want to create as many opportunities for your team to speak to you. I would say that it's important that you let your team flag concerns or just have a listening ear. There's so many things going on at the moment and so many emotions, and everybody's kind of been with you on this ride. And so to have a two-way dialogue, it can't just be a leader constantly giving a video update at the end of the day and shoving it down
Mm.
people's throats, because you want to make sure that you're demonstrating to your team, hey, I hear you and I see you and we are doing this together. And that together piece, I'm going to underline that and bold that, because that is so important to building a strong culture, is that you're listening and reacting. And I would say if you're looking and listening to this and thinking, well, how do I do this virtually? Because you're the kind of person that likes to have that informal conversation in the break room. There are so many ways that you can mimic that online. There are tools like Slack where people can constantly have chats and you can have one-to-one conversations. There's Google Chat if you have the Google Suite. There's Microsoft Teams. You can map out time in your diary for informal one-to-one. So you can say on Wednesday from 2 to 5, I'm going to have no meetings in my diary, because that's time for you guys to schedule a quick one-to-one with me if you just want to have a conversation. There are way too many ways that you can bring that to life. It doesn't just have to be in person. And if you're not a video person, you can do it over the phone. Just make sure that you're allowing yourself to have that two-way dialogue. I would say just outside of that two-way piece, it's just making sure that you acknowledge that there is life outside of work and that you're allowing your team to connect with you on a human level. So how do we build a culture virtually is one question. How do we build a culture virtually in a global pandemic? That's
Mm.
probably a whole other piece. And I saw this great thing on LinkedIn a while back that was floating around that said, don't forget, you're not just working from home, you're working from home during a global pandemic. And there is a huge difference from that.
Yeah.
Great, great cultures like your Googles or your Apples, the ones that we're constantly reading about in our Harvard Business Review articles and the like, are cultures that treat their employees like adults. A lot of times I hear leaders talking about things that almost treat their employees as children. And don't get me wrong, as much as our employees can sometimes maybe act in an immature way, or have a reaction that we might not necessarily want, they are adults that are working from you and they have lives outside of work. And you need to remember that a lot of these, especially our parents, at one point they would have been teachers, they would have been chefs, they would have been counselors. They would have been doing all of these things outside of work, and all of this was happening in the same span of time. And so we need to make sure that, number one, we're allowing our employees to talk to us about their mental health and their state. And even if that's not something that you feel comfortable talking about, just allowing your team to have space to talk to each other and have adult time.
Mm.
This is what I'm going through. I saw a great example of an organization that on Monday mornings after their team meeting, they have tea time, where literally everybody brings their hot drink, they bring their biscuits, and all they do is just talk about what's going on in their lives. That takes 15 minutes out of your Monday morning, but the joy and happiness and satisfaction that's going to bring to your employees is going to reap so much more rewards than just that insignificant amount of time.
Mm.
Second, you need to encourage a work-life balance. So I know that there are a lot of leaders that are going, oh, I love this work from home life, because my team members are signing on at 7 a.m. and they're not signing off until 7 p.m. And look, if that's what makes your employee happy and they want to do that, and perhaps it's an escape from everything that's going on around them, great. Happy for you to do that. But don't forget, especially with our younger team members or people that are new to the business, they may see other people do that and they may feel like they have to. And the negative effects of somebody overworking themselves and getting burnout is not what you want to do. And as a leader, you do not want to flag to people, hey, I value you burning yourself out for me, because that is not a constructive culture. That's a destructive culture. You have a lot more sick days. You have a lot more turnover, all of the negatives that are the opposite of what we talked about at the very beginning of this. So make sure that if you see your employees are doing that, just reach out to them every once in a while and go, hey, if you want to do that, great. But I don't want you to feel obliged to do that. And I would encourage you to make sure that you have that balance of work and play, because you need to have rest time to give your all during that 9 to 5. So really looking at that, and then actually being flexible. We were talking about this the other day, actually. I think a lot of employers are going, well, I have work from home now, so I'm a flexible employer. No, no. In 2020, unfortunately, you being forced to have work from home doesn't necessarily make you a flexible employer. Okay. When we look at the modern way of working and living, that boundary between home life and work life is really just not there anymore. And I go back to that piece about especially our parents or our carers who have other people that they're trying to keep into this 9 to 5 bubble as well. And so it's just making sure that if you treat your employees like adults, that you allow them to take control of their schedule and you give them that flexibility that says, I understand that you have other things that are going to fit into your world outside of just this. As long as you achieve these goals or these targets for me and we don't have an issue, then I'm happy for you to take the lead on however you want to achieve that in the best way possible for you. So I'm not saying that you just need to give everybody free reign. Some cultures that works perfectly, other places it doesn't. But it's about allowing your employees to kind of feel like they have some command over that, because that will lead to an increase in productivity, because you may get more done in 6 hours than you do in 12, just because you're putting your brain into that time period when you are looking at that.
And what about things like activities that people want to join in on or don't want to join in on? We've talked before about this Zoom quiz that was the thing, and it was great, and I think everybody loved it for a period of time. But I feel like we need more than that now.
Absolutely. And I think this kind of comes into play with probably things that you should not do as an organization, but let's start there. So one of the ways in which we build a great culture virtually is to have that two-way dialogue and to try to build a camaraderie amongst our team. And so part of doing that is to schedule activities that people actually want to join in on. So let's bring it back to that Zoom quiz, because at first it felt really fun. And actually in America, I think the equivalent of that was a Zoom happy hour, which a lot of places did that too over here. But what happened is maybe everybody joined in the beginning, and then a few weeks in, it was just those two loyal employees that were joining us every week, which I did join a few of those and did see that. And so a lot of employers go, well, I'm doing everything I can to build a culture with my team, but they're just not giving it back to me. And my challenge to you as an employer is to go, okay, you do need to schedule these kinds of activities, and that's a great idea, but have you asked your team what they actually want to join in on? Because it has to be authentic to them. We live in a incredibly diverse world, and something that I often bring up is a lot of younger generations don't even like to drink. So if you're having a Zoom happy hour and you've got majority of your employees who that doesn't appeal to them, well, it's no wonder they're not joining you, or perhaps you're burning out the same thing by having it over and over again. So having that two-way dialogue and listening to them means you're scheduling activities that they actually want to join. And it will also take a burden off you, because it means you don't always have to be creating these things. You can allow them to take control of that and suggest and lead that for you, which will also mean you'll probably get a higher participation rate, rather, if they're feeling accountable and responsible for doing that. But I would say along the line of that, in terms of things that you should not do if you're looking to grow a great culture virtually, is number one, avoiding conversation or your team entirely. So a lot of times, again, I'm going back to that leader that's probably a little bit burnt out in themselves. They are in meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, or they're talking with clients. And so the entirety of their day is spent outside of engaging with their team. And understand that has to happen on certain days or somewhat, but you can't avoid conversation or your team entirely. Another thing that I often hear is, well, I don't want to have a conversation because it's just going to be negative and deconstructive, and there's nothing I can do about them complaining. So you may get some of that. But what you need to do is structure the conversation in a way to go, I understand that you guys have grievances and concerns, and I want to make sure that you have the proper channels to vent and do that. But I also want to make sure as a leader that I can help you overcome those battles. So I want you to come prepared with your grievance, but I also want you to give me some solutions of how you think that we can overcome that together. Because you don't just have to avoid it if you're concerned it's going to be complaining. You can kind of use that coaching methodology to make sure you're having a constructive conversation. Number two is overscheduling activity. Now, again, every single culture is different. And so if you have probably like a younger team who doesn't necessarily have a lot of family engagements or other responsibilities, then you probably can get away with meeting or having culture building activities more often. I think back to a lot of the places I worked at as a younger person, and, starting my career, I'm wanting to meet people in a new city or just feel like I'm not alone. Especially now, we've got a lot of people that perhaps living in a flat by themselves. So they're actually looking forward to these activities. But you may have a team that has families or other engagements or is caring for people, and therefore having something constantly happening all the time is just going to turn them off completely. So listen to your team and only schedule it as much as people feel like they want to get involved. And again, you can let them drive it for you and let them make those decisions in terms of how often is good enough. And I would say with that, a no-no is only scheduling culture building activity out of office hours. I laugh when I say this because I think there is a definite need to make sure that when we have office hours that we are delivering to our customers as much as possible. And I know the lines are blurred these days, and a lot of customers are probably reaching out to you more than they were before this pandemic. However, having 1 hour out of a 40-hour work week to allow your team to talk to each other and to make friends in their office is not going to ruin your business. You are not going to stop trading because you gave up 1 out of 40 hours. And it's important that we put that perspective into play. Because a great example is if you only do things on Friday after 5 p.m., well, how many people are going to have to leave on Fridays at 5 p.m. because they have other things that they need to do? And so what happens is that person never gets to get involved in talking to their colleagues. And there's a real famous question on a lot of American employee engagement surveys that says, do you have a best friend at work? Which the British equivalent of that is, do you have a friend at work? Because we don't necessarily use that phrase over here. That only happens when people feel like they have time to get to know each other. And if I'm always going to you and saying, Heidi, where's that report? Heidi, where are you with this? Heidi, can you tell me an update on what's happening with this customer? Then we might have that small talk at the beginning of the day to go, how was your weekend? And you've got that 5 minutes back and forth, like, oh, it's fine. Okay, done, straight to work. Then I'm never going to get to know you. And the more that I know you, the better we're going to work together, because the more I know your personality, the more I know what you like and what you dislike. And so great cultures aren't a bunch of best friends, okay? They are colleagues, but they're people who know each other and they understand each other and they actively try to work together. And that happens not when we're talking about a report, but when we're talking about things completely outside of work. And so you need to think about that trade-off, because number one, it's going to make your team work together better, but they're also going to feel so appreciated, because a 40-hour work week is most of our lives. And so if we feel like we have an hour back, we're going to really respect and value the employer that respected and valued us by doing that. So it's important that it's not always out of hours. And I would say the last thing that is on our cardinal sin list of what to do or what not to do in a great culture is only listen to your own assumptions. So many times I know there are so many things on LinkedIn and social media of employers saying, well, I'm dealing with this, or my team feels this way. And then we've got our busy leader who, again, isn't really having time to take a pulse check on their in team. So they go, okay, well, I think people are a little disengaged, and I saw this on LinkedIn, so that's definitely what's happening in my business. And so creating those assumptions can actually be a really deconstructive thing for your culture, because a lot of times it has nothing to do with your business. Just like as individuals, all of our businesses and all of our cultures are different. So it's important that you don't just listen to what you think is going on because you're afraid of having that conversation like we talked about up front, but you're asking your team and making sure that you're reacting to the things that are actually on their minds.
So once the culture's built and we're kind of getting there, how do business leaders sustain that culture virtually?
This is so important because a lot of people probably don't have those foundational basics that we talked about at
Mhm.
the beginning there. And so that culture is kind of in and out. When we're having a team night out, it feels great. And then we get to the office and it's completely fallen flat again. But even if you take all of these recommendations and you're actively building your culture, it can also fall flat from there. Okay, we constantly have to feed it and nurture it and make sure that it's surviving through this, which is why you constantly need to take an umbrella approach and step out and go, where are we? So the first thing that you need to do is listen to your team and adapt your tactics as needed. So, a great example, because sales is something that we're all focused on in this environment. If you put £100 into Facebook advertising and you got no return from it, would you just keep throwing £100 at Facebook again and again and again? No, you would not. You would ask yourself, what's going on here? Why isn't this giving me the return that I want to see from that? And it's the same with your culture. You have to look and measure your success and go, where are we? So you want to keep your finger on the pulse by measuring staff engagement. And if it's near death, you need to revive it. Well, how do you actually go about measuring staff engagement? There are a lot of different ways that you can go about doing this, and so many tools. And I'd say really it just depends on the size of your organization, because if you're a micro SME who's got maybe a couple of different employees, then having a survey probably doesn't feel authentic to you, because you can probably have a conversation with your team members individually to get that gauge from them. But if you're a huge organization, you're not necessarily going to have time for a one-to-one with every individual in the business. So you can look at things like Google Forms. There are so many different tools, Survey Monkey, that you can use to have that time. And I would always say to balance it with offer an in-person way of doing that, but also look at a survey, because then you can have an actual tactical measurement of our engagement increased by X% over this time. But with that in mind, you need to make sure that you are getting an honest measurement when you are doing this. So my great example is that, unfortunately, as much as you value your team and as much as you feel like you're giving your all to gain people's respect and to make sure that you have this open door policy, the reality is there are going to be people in the business that do have a level of fear or feel like they can't openly articulate their honest opinions. I'd say if you're that CEO that's very involved in the business, and unfortunately you have to be having the conversations with people to say, where are we with sales targets? Why isn't this done? And it feels like every time you're having a conversation with your team, it's not necessarily in the best light. You might not be the best person for people to talk to and openly articulate that. So just be honest with yourself. It doesn't mean you're a bad leader. It doesn't mean you have a bad culture. It's just doing the right thing to make sure there is a channel for people to go to be able to have that conversation. And so it may be a HR person, it may be the marketing director, it might be the operations director, it can be anybody. But just think, if I send out a survey or offer one-to-ones, are people going to have that conversation with me? If they don't, you need to find another channel for them to do that. But you also
Mm.
need to think about what you can do to help alleviate some of those issues of people being honest. And part of that is capturing that information and actively showing people I've listened and I've reacted to it in your favor. And that will let
That's the key thing, isn't it? I think if,
us.
it's all well and good getting people to complete a survey, but if there's never anything off the back of it, there's a problem, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is it. If it's near death and you're just letting it die, then unfortunately you're never going to get anywhere. And also I think with some teams and some cultures, what happens when you just do a survey, but you never react is that people go, well, they're capturing my response, but they're not
Mm.
doing anything about it. So what's the purpose of them doing that? Are they doing anything malicious with it? I mean, we have to really put ourselves into the heads of human beings. Unfortunately, as human beings, when we are not sure, we make those assumptions, as I talked about earlier, and it's never in the employer's favor. So you might be doing things behind the scenes, but you need to articulate if you are reacting to that, because again, it shows that you're learning and growing, and that's absolutely what you want as a business. I would say in that light, how do you sustain a culture virtually? Well, it's not just the leader that needs to do that, okay? It needs to be the entire business. And so what's really important for you and your time and your resources is to also make sure that you distribute accountability across your team. When I work with these big brand projects with organizations, obviously there's a lot of change that goes on internally. And so one of the things that we have to look at is, well, how do we get everybody else involved so it's not just driving on one person or one team to do all of the work? And so we often look at something called brand champions, which are people throughout all levels of the business. So it's not just our managers, it can be people that are entry level, way up to the top. And those people are responsible for taking the pulse of their department, for scheduling activities, for taking ideas and bringing them up to management and meeting with other departments in the business to make sure that we're fostering and cultivating that culture across all levels. So also make sure you consider something like that. If you know that you're going to be strapped for time in December because it's year end and you're going to be really busy with all of the different things that need to happen, then see who else you can make sure to drive that. I think one of the businesses that I work for had chief fun officers, which is a slight twist on CFO, not just finances. And I love that because they were two
Mm.
people that were fun. They were people that naturally everybody kind of went to when it came to culture building activities. And by giving them that informal or formal title, it meant that they really took accountability for their role, and it made a huge difference internally. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do that.
Fab. But we've talked about loads of different topics today, and both Courtney and I are absolutely more than happy to talk further if anybody would like any more information. So if you want to have a chat about the current recruitment landscape, building your team, developing your team, you can reach me or another one of our sector specialists within the culture team via our website, which is Culture Recruitment.
And you can reach me at my website, which is www.createandpropel. If you have any questions about what we've talked about today, building a culture, anything about your brand, I offer every single new client a free 30-minute consultation. So even if it's just to talk about what Heidi and I talked about today and get some advice, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation. So please do check out my site.